Did you know boxing dates back to 3000 BC, when ancient Sumerians fought with their fists for honor? The Romans even turned it into a brutal blood sport with metal-studded gloves. But here's a crazy twist. In the 18th century, boxing was illegal in England, yet it thrived underground as wealthy patrons placed massive bets. And believe it or not, boxing gloves were only made mandatory in 1867. Before that, bare-knuckle bouts often ended with broken bones. Get ready for a knockout journey through the history of boxing, revealing its gritty roots, iconic moments, and untold legends. Boxing is one of the oldest sports in human history, and its beginnings are as raw and thrilling as you might imagine. Ancient carvings from Sumeria, dating back more than 5,000 years, show people throwing punches in organized fights. By 1350 BCE, the Egyptians had their own version of boxing, with paintings showing fighters in front of crowds, proving that even back then, people loved the drama of a good fight. But the Greeks, they turned boxing into a true test of survival. In 1688 BCE, it became an Olympic event. These bouts were brutal. Fighters wore thin leather straps on their fists for protection, but that's about as far as safety went. There were no time limits or breaks. The only way a match ended was if one fighter collapsed or surrendered. The Greeks believed that boxing built character, and it was often used to train soldiers. The first Olympic champion in boxing, a guy named Adamastus of Samaria, is still remembered for his incredible endurance. And you know what? The Greeks also believed boxing was a sport favored by the gods. Mythology says Apollo, the god of music and healing, was also a boxing champion. How's that for a paradox? A god of healing, inspired by one of the world's most violent sports. Then came the Romans, who upped the violence. They added metal studs to their gloves, turning boxing into a deadly spectacle. Matches often ended in serious injury or even death. Imagine stepping into an arena where thousands cheered for bloodshed. It was less sport and more gladiatorial combat. Eventually, the Roman Emperor Theodoric banned boxing in 500 CE because of its excessive brutality. Meanwhile, boxing wasn't just a Mediterranean thing. In ancient India, warriors practiced a form of martial arts called Vajramushti, which involved fist fighting with knuckle dusters. These matches combined physical combat with spiritual and martial discipline. It shows how universal the urge to fight and to watch fighting really is. Well, after the fall of the Roman Empire, boxing faded from the limelight. The rise of Christianity played a significant role, as many viewed the sport's violent nature as incompatible with religious values. By the Middle Ages, it was practically extinct in Europe, but human nature being what it is, fistfighting remained a raw, underground activity practiced informally in rural areas and backstreets. By the 17th century, boxing began to re-emerge in England, fueled by a mix of necessity and entertainment. With swords falling out of fashion, people turned to fencing with fists. The first recorded prize fights appeared in 1681, and they were a chaotic affair. Fighters used bare fists, and matches allowed basically anything. Headbutts, chokes, even eye gouging. No weight classes or referees meant it was as much about survival as it was skill. The sport truly started to evolve thanks to a man named James Figg, who was recognized as the first boxing champion in 1719. He is also remembered as the father of boxing. Figg wasn't just a fighter, he was a showman and entrepreneur. He opened a boxing academy in London and popularized the sport as a blend of skill and bravery. He combined boxing with fencing and cudgeling at his amphitheater in London, attracting massive audiences. Figg's influence was so profound that he laid the groundwork for boxing as a legitimate sport, complete with rules and structure. Figg even referred to boxing as the manly art of self-defense, a phrase that stuck around. In 1743, Jack Broughton, a former champion and pupil of James Figg, decided to tame the chaos a little. He created the first set of formal boxing rules, known as Broughton's Rules. These rules introduced a few critical elements to make fights slightly safer, like banning blows to a downed opponent and introducing a 30-second recovery period for fighters who were knocked down. The fighters were still bloody, but these changes were revolutionary. For example, Broughton himself promoted the use of gloves or mufflers during training to prevent serious injuries. However, the gloves weren't used in actual fights until much later. What's fascinating is how these rules laid the groundwork for modern boxing. Before Broughton, fighters could use techniques like kicking or wrestling. His rules, though, started shaping boxing into a distinct sport. One of his famous matches, though, ended badly for him. He lost to Jack Slack in 1750 due to an eye injury, forcing him to retire. But even in defeat, Broughton's contribution cemented his legacy as the father of English boxing. Broughton's amphitheater, where he taught and promoted these rules, was a hub for boxing enthusiasts. His rules remained in use until they were replaced by the London prize ring rules in 1838. What's even more surprising? Jack Broughton's grave in Westminster Abbey wasn't marked with the epitaph he wanted, Champion of England, until almost 200 years later. In 1867, the Marquess of Queensberry rules changed boxing forever. These rules weren't created by the Marquis himself, but by John Graham Chambers, a British sports enthusiast. The Marquis lent his name to them, which gave the rules aristocratic credibility. What did these rules do? Well, they required padded gloves, introduced 3-minute rounds with 1-minute breaks, and established the iconic 10 count for knockouts. These changes might seem simple, but they were revolutionary. Before this, bare-knuckle brawls could last hours, often ending with someone collapsing from exhaustion, or worse. One of the first fighters to embrace the rules was John L. Sullivan, known as the Boston Strong Boy. He became the last bare-knuckle champion and the first heavyweight champion under the Queensberry rules. His legendary 75-round fight with Jake Kilrin in 1889 was so grueling it became part of boxing folklore. That fight marked the end of the brutal bare-knuckle era and ushered in modern boxing. Another twist, the rules turned boxing from a free-for-all slugfest into a strategic sport. Fighters began using gloves not just for hitting, but for defense, giving rise to the now familiar stance with gloves up to protect the face. Weight classes also became standard, ensuring fairer competition. These changes made boxing safer and more structured, but didn't dilute its intensity. The spectacle remained, but the risk of fatal injuries dropped significantly. The 20th century truly marked the golden age of boxing, a period filled with iconic fighters, groundbreaking moments, and global cultural impact. Jack Dempsey kicked off the roaring 1920s as one of the boxing's first megastars. Known as the Manassa Mauler, he brought a relentless, knockout-focused style that thrilled crowds. His 1921 fight with Georges Carpentier was the first $1 million gate in sports history, a feat unimaginable at the time. Dempsey's bouts with Gene Tunney later in the decade were legendary. One of them, the 1927 Long Count fight, was watched by over 145,000 fans live and millions more on the newly popular radio. It became a cornerstone of American sports lore. Then came Joe Louis in the 1930s and 40s, nicknamed the Brown Bomber. Louis held the heavyweight title for over 11 years, the longest reign ever. But his impact went far beyond boxing. In 1938, Louis fought Max Schmeling in a rematch that carried heavy political symbolism. Schmeling, unfairly associated with Nazi Germany, was no match for Louis, who knocked him out in just over 2 minutes. This fight became a symbol of democracy versus fascism, and Louis became a hero for millions of Americans, particularly African Americans during an era of segregation. But let's not forget Sugar Ray Robinson, who very well may be considered the best boxer of all time. He was so good that people created the term pound for pound just to describe how skilled he was. Robinson had it all: speed, power, and style. Watching him fight was like watching a master painter at work. He inspired countless fighters and fans with his flawless technique. And then, of course, there was Muhammad Ali. Ali didn't just box, he made boxing an event. He called himself the greatest, and he proved it in the ring with his incredible skill and lightning-fast reflexes. But Ali was more than an athlete. He fought for civil rights, spoke against the Vietnam War, and captivated the world with his charisma. Ali's refusal to fight in Vietnam cost him years of his career, but made him a cultural icon. His fights, like the Rumble in the Jungle against George Foreman and the Thrilla in Manila against Joe Frazier, were epic. People all over the world stopped what they were doing just to watch. Even outside the heavyweight division, the 20th century was filled with stars. The Four Kings, Robert Durand, Marvin Hagler, Sugar Ray Leonard, and Thomas Hearns, dominated the lighter weight classes. These fights were so intense and dramatic that fans still argue about which one is the best. Well, weight classes? Those were a game changer, but they didn't exist until the late 19th century. Before then, it was David versus Goliath in every match. Smaller fighters often stood no chance, and it was brutal. And then came the organizations. The World Boxing Association, or the WBA, was one of the first, formed in 1962. Soon after, others like the World Boxing Council, WBC, International Boxing Federation, IBF, and World Boxing Organization, WBO, joined the scene. Each one crowned champions in every weight class. Sounds, well, kind of. Having multiple organizations also meant there could be 4 champions in the same weight class at the same time. Imagine 4 people claiming to be the best. It's like having 4 winners in a single race. This led to fans craving unification fights, where champions from different organizations faced off to see who was the real king of the ring. But did you know that weight classes have a history of controversy? The introduction of tweener divisions like super featherweight and light middleweight was met with skepticism. These categories, designed to level the playing field even further, sometimes led to confusion about who the real champions were. Yet they also gave rise to legendary fighters like Manny Pacquiao, the only boxer to win titles in 8 different weight classes. In 2020, the WBC introduced a brand new division called Bridgerweight for fighters between cruiserweight and heavyweight. This was named after a real-life hero, Bridger Walker, a 6-year-old who saved his sister from a dog attack. How cool is that? It shows how boxing evolved to honor both history and modern stories. Today, boxing is no longer just a sport, it's a global cultural phenomenon. In Mexico, boxing is almost a religion, with stars like Julio Cesar Chavez inspiring millions. The Philippines is home to Manny Pacquiao, a boxer so iconic that he became a senator and used his earnings to fund schools and hospitals. Meanwhile, the UK boasts champions like Anthony Joshua, whose fights fill massive arenas and attract global audiences. Films like Rocky and Raging Bull romanticize the sport, showing its gritty, emotional battles. Rocky was shot on a tight budget, but became an Oscar-winning phenomenon, inspiring generations. In the modern era, boxing also thrives in the digital space. Fighters use platforms like Instagram to connect with fans, sharing training routines and personal stories. This direct interaction humanizes them and draws younger audiences to the sport. Video games like Fight Night and streaming platforms have also brought boxing to new generations, making it more accessible than ever before. So what's your favorite boxing match of all time? Is it Ali's Rumble in the Jungle, Tyson's jaw-dropping knockouts, or maybe a recent showdown? Let us know down in the comments section below.